the panel that's coming up next is speaking about leadership, right? And leadership is so important in anything. So, I mean, bad leadership can sink a ship.
Absolutely.
The right kind of leadership can help that ship sail through the most turbulent waters, right? And one could argue that we're in pretty turbulent waters right now, just given the fact that you've got a cost of living crisis, you still have the overhang of the COVID-19 pandemic, you've got a recession or stagflation, whichever part of the world you are in right now, and you've also got a huge populace on this continent, young people who don't have jobs. And so the next panel will be speaking to how leadership needs to transform in the higher education sector just to better prepare some of these young people for the world of work. And let's meet the panelists.
Dr. Rose Mukankomeje, Director General of the Higher Education Council, Rwanda. Professor Malcolm McIver, CEO and Provost, Lancaster University, Ghana, and Vice Chairman, Council of Independent Universities. Jonathan Foster-Pedley, Dean and Director, Henley Business School. J. Richards Hill, Director, Education Industry for Middle East and Africa, Microsoft Corp. And the moderator is CNBC Africa anchor, Fifi Peters.
Hey, good to be back with you all. So the next panel, looking at transformation in higher education leadership. And I do have my panelists there ready and waiting to weigh in on this. So just want to start off with a bit of a preamble, though, because a recent PwC survey of higher education, the landscape here in Africa, Australia and Singapore, the Middle East also, as well as the UK, found that only 44% of respondents thought that their institutions were doing a good job in strengthening partnerships with industry to become a whole lot more internationally competitive. And from this, it did emerge that governments need to, one, play a bigger role in supporting the higher education sector as it does undergo a profound transition by fixing regulations. Then institutions themselves need to do what is right for their students and their industry partners. So let's get into that right now. So good afternoon to everyone.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Wonderful. I'm a firm believer in ladies first. And Jay, I'd like to begin with you, ma'am, just to find out what you think about that statistic. Pretty bleak that more than half of students right now think that their institutions are not preparing them adequately for the world of work. And you have had the opportunity to work on both sides as a teacher and now an employer. What do you think about that and their sentiments?
I think their sentiments are well made, actually, and you could say the same for institutions, because they're also telling us that the pipeline between education and the world of work is broken. It's a massive challenge all over the world, and very much reflective of a disconnect we're seeing in what we're teaching in schools. And we need to get better, certainly, at partnerships with industry, particularly in higher education, so that degrees and qualifications that young people have when they come out into the world of work are relevant to the new jobs and the new employment market. We see a lot of people coming out of university with good degrees, but they don't have anything else to accompany that. And together with no experience, obviously, in the world of work, then that makes them, puts them a bit at a disadvantage. What we see success looking like is where young people coming through university spend a lot of time thinking about what careers they want to go into and what skills and qualifications they're going to need, as well as their degree, in order to move into those fields of work. And there are lots of options open. While they're at university, they can think about taking short learning programs or do industry certifications. And when they come out of university and start looking for work, their qualification, coupled with those additional certifications or short learning program or micro credentials, even, showing that they've done something with what they know, that makes them much more attractive to employers, particularly if they orient those additional certifications or qualifications towards what employers are looking for. And so a lot of research they need to do, use sites like LinkedIn to get market insights, to see what employers are looking for, what will put them ahead of the pack when they come to apply for jobs. But certainly I think our education institutions at all levels need to get better at supporting young people around the reality of the world of work and what's necessary to be successful.
Sure. So I'm going to actually ask all the speakers what they think about the statistics right now, because I mean, Jay, you're talking about the fact that these young people come out with a degree and that's it. Except for most of their lives, they've been told that that's exactly what you need. You go throughout the entire school system, you get a degree, you come out, and the future is yours. The reality, obviously, is completely different. So, Professor McLeaver, just your thoughts on the sentiments that more young people right now, 44%. Think that institutions are not setting them well, are not preparing them well for the world of work. Do you think that's fair on the part of institutions?
I think that figure is surprisingly low. I would have expected it to be considerably higher. And I think that as an industry, that yes, we are failing students in many respects. What we have is a model of delivery that has been in existence for over 1,000 years, and in some countries, much more than 1,000 years. And yet we are preparing students for a workplace that bears no resemblance to 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. And I was actually talking to somebody recently, and I made the comment that if Sir Isaac Newton came back today, he would fit very comfortably into any university in the world. He would recognize the systems that we are using. So the model itself, I would argue, is not fit for purpose in terms of the 21st century. Our traditional model is based very much upon the acquisition of knowledge. It's based upon this transition from primary to secondary to tertiary education. It's based upon the acquisition of knowledge, which is then exchanged in return for a qualification. And in large part, that model has existed because of the leadership within the education sector. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some good leaders within the education sector, but it's what tends to happen is that people will perpetuate the system that they know, the system that they are comfortable with. For example, universities today, just as they were in my time, are seen as citadels of the young. The vast majority of people in universities go at the age of 18. You see very few mature students. And in terms of education, mature is considered to be anybody over the age of 25. So we are not accessible to many people. What we deliver is very traditional theoretical programs, 3-4 years in length, and are not always preparing people for the workplace.
John, your thoughts? I mean, your institution's slightly different in that you don't necessarily deal with undergraduates. You deal a lot with a lot of working professionals who come and further their education. But I mean, the fact that, as Prof. McLeaver has said, the education system has failed a lot of young people. I'm wondering if those young people can qualify for a refund, those ones who got a degree and, are not seeing the future that was promised. But nonetheless, if it is known that there is a huge challenge right now with how higher institutions conduct themselves, if we accept that is known, just given the fact that we're all looking at the same numbers, we're all looking at the growing number of unemployed young people, it's not something that we woke up to. Why is it that the status quo then, in your view, has remained for so long?
Well, I really enjoyed the comments of both Jay and Malcolm there. And Henley is actually part of University of Reading, which covers all those sort of degrees, etc. you've talked about, and we have some fantastic campuses, and we also scattered around the world in our Henley Business School operation. So Henley Business School has undergrad programs, but in Africa we don't have undergraduates who come straight from school, but we have plenty of people who have left school, couldn't get jobs initially, and then managed to get probably low-level jobs, who because of the victims of the past, whatever happened, were unable to get the opportunity they might, and so are working. And a lot of those people who are working haven't got any form of degree. In fact, a lot of our people come and do degree-level work at the age of 37, which is the average level for some of our programs, which are equivalent of first year of degrees, and then year after year they immediately progress up. It's world-changing for them. So while I'm not going to dispute the analyses Malcolm has in any way, particularly about what the education system has done and what's We've heard a lot about from Ken Robinson. So Ken Robinson used to talk about how we've strip mined people's minds, with a system of education that's not fit for anything. I do notice a lot of very gifted and enthusiastic and capable people within education trying to change it around. I mean, go to Finland, you've got some fantastic experiential programs, or Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, Holland, Denmark, and in the UK as well, and in places around Africa. Lancaster, well known as a great university in the UK, in Ghana, doing great work as well. Siebes is there as well. So and while it's easy to kind of do the diagnostic of how terrible the situation is, Mandela used to say, make your decisions based on hope, not on fear. So my hope is that we look at the reality of what's going on around the world, and we do build on what we can do, which is be brave to build better systems of education. Now, a lot of that's happening in Microsoft or in Apple or other companies who are credentializing, giving people learning to do the jobs. But there is something really important about deep education at universities, liberal arts education, to develop the critical thinking capability to analyze complex environments, to understand what business means in the context of the world, and to think beyond the current capitalistic system to the emerging ones that are coming out. So while we're not creating people for the current jobs, that's true, nor are we creating people who can transform the economies to become more future ready, away from basic factors of production into creative innovation, etc. And that's what we need in Africa and emerging countries. And you are seeing that. So depending on the lens you put in, the world is as doomy or optimistic as you feel like. And I'd like to sit somewhere in the middle and say, we can do this. And that's where I sit.
I hope you're right. But I think we're going to talk about how we can do it in more detail. Dr. Rose, ma'am, just for you, can you give us a taste and the picture of what is happening in Rwanda's education space right now, and what kind of leadership you think is necessary to successfully transform education there, ma'am?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us to come on board. I'm talking from a regulatory point of view, whereby during this COVID period, I think most of our respective countries were surprised by this pandemic. Institutions were closed in order to reduce the spread of the pandemic. But however, high learning institutions were encouraged to embrace this new way of doing business. But unfortunately, some were not prepared. Having tools, having access to internet, specifically those who were staying in rural areas, it was a little bit difficult for them, specifically for students, in order to be able to follow. But for Rwanda, I think, and for other countries, the leadership has to be ready and try to find a way to embrace these new technologies in order to allow a student and allow families to be able to follow. This e-learning is becoming, it is not going to be a lux, it is going to be a facility, it is going to be something which we have to learn to use and to live with. So infrastructure is a prerequisite. Having internet access, having energy, but also having even lecturers who are prepared. So the leadership is key in order to join the world. Of course, in some areas like medicine, like sciences, sometimes it will be difficult. We cannot be, I understand, for business school, you can stay where you are. But when it comes to the practice, the laboratories, it will need people to have this part of face-to-face if we want really to learn. Of course, the traditional way of doing business is taking us, as my predecessor was saying, to go to school, it was to go and be face-to-face. But today, we have to change and embrace the new way of doing business. I thank you.
Sure. So, ma'am, I think I want to continue from where you have left off, and just fleshing out the character traits that make this transformative leader, as it were. And Prof. McLeaver, perhaps you lead us here, because I mean, while we can say that 2020 was a surprise for us all, we've had around 2 years or so to adjust to that surprise and to learn and to also better plan and better prepare for the possibility of future surprises. So when we talk about transformative leadership, let's unpack that. So what does a transformative leader look like? What are the traits, in your view, sir, that make a transformative leader?
Okay. Thank you, Fifi. And could I start also by saying thank you, John, for that glowing endorsement of Lancaster University. John, it was much appreciated.
Great place.
In terms of transformative leadership, quite simply, it is a shared approach. It is where leaders and the followers work together in order to help each other, in order to take each other to the next level, in order to be prepared to face future challenges. It's very much a collaborative approach that is based upon meeting realistic, pragmatic needs. It's not about, and if I could come back to what I was saying earlier on, it's not simply about giving people theoretical solutions to problems. It's about giving them practical solutions to problems. And it's about ensuring that the industry, the education industry, is continually evolving to meet those growing problems that people face within society, within the workplace.
Yeah, so when you and I had a discussion prior to today, you were also talking about the importance of a lot of leaders in academic institutions reflecting the demographic of the continent.
Yes.
And while I respect you highly, sir, you know, the grays on your beard suggest that, you know, you're not entirely representative of the demographics, and that there's room for a lot more younger, fresher.
I agree with you wholeheartedly.
And so the question does become, and thanks so much for taking the joke, the question does become how you get those young people working more closely with you, volunteering and choosing a career in academia. So, because it does seem to be the case that there's a bit of a lack of that right now.
Again, you are absolutely right. The average age, I think, globally of a lecturer in universities is somewhere between 47 and 50 years of age. We are an aging population. Most young people do not want to go into education. And I think one of the reasons is because it is seen as the ivory towers of academia. It is seen as somewhere where people can go to pontificate about the problems of the world without actually coming up with solutions. What we need to do is we need to bring in industry into education. We need our senior management of education institutions to actually reflect the communities in which we are trying to serve, the communities we are trying to operate. One of the things that I think that could be done is governments, for example, could change the regulations, especially for the public sector, in terms of the appointment of senior management. We could also be looking at shared working opportunities and experiences. So you could have people spending 50% of their time in industry, 50% of their time within the education setting. We also need to move away from this notion that simply being a professor with a PhD, and I'm guilty, I am one of those, being a professor with a PhD doesn't mean to say that you actually have the answers that people need. You do not have the experience, you do not have the relevance in terms of 21st century industry. So we need to work closely with industry. We need to bring industry into the classroom, but we also need to make sure that our academics move out of the classroom and are working within industry. There's a number of professions, for example, where it is incumbent upon them, particularly in the health services, to actually maintain their clinical practice. I worked in the health sector for many years, and when I was an academic, I was required to spend 20% of my time in clinical practice. It kept me relevant, it kept me up to date, and it meant that my students could relate to me and I could relate to them. Unfortunately, in many aspects of industry, of education, that no longer applies. We have academics who are far removed from the realities of the 21st century workplace, and we have senior management who also are so far removed that they simply perpetuate the paradigm that they are comfortable with, the paradigm they are familiar with.
I think you also speak into the topic or the concept of maybe even reverse mentoring there, because I think that, you know, while, you know, your PhD speaks a lot of things, there's a lot that your PhD can still teach, you know, a younger person, and there's a lot that a younger person can teach yourself, sir. And so, Jay, I mean, just following on what Professor McLeaver has said in terms of getting industry to work more in the classrooms and taking the academics more into industry, you also, prior to our discussion today, just spoke about the fact that that pipeline had somewhat been distorted or broken. In fact, those are the words that you used. And I mean, Professor McLeaver had said that perhaps regulation can be something that perhaps helps restore that pipeline. But just in your view, how do you get that going again as you see it?
Okay, I mean, I'm not too sure what Malcolm meant about the regulatory change, but certainly I think we've got to look to broaden the pipeline as well as to fix it. So we know that there's that lots of young people are in university and they're getting their qualifications and they're going to be looking for work. And them having the appropriate skills that will build qualities like agility, resilience, and creativity, of course, are important. But we've also got to think about equity of access. And what that means is making education more widely available to a larger proportion of the population. Now, that might include people who have been in work for some time and who need or want to reskill or learn new things. It might involve, you know, people who want to learn but still want to work. So the education needs to fit around their lifestyle. And certainly by shifting perhaps an emphasis away from totally being on that 3 or 4 year degree towards an environment where there are things like short learning programs where you can do courses in chunks and bits, modules, and build up those qualifications while you're still working. And that industry and education really form a tight partnership so that both understand the needs of each other. That's really going to support the broadening of that pipeline and grow equity of access. And transformational leadership in higher education really involves leaders having what we call a growth mindset. So that really everything is on the table for discussion, nothing is precluded, and that they're able to really think through the challenges that education has, that industry has, and how those partnerships might work together to solve those challenges. And change management is a huge element of any transformation strategy that we put in place. And change management has to work from the ground up. So it's about individual ownership of change. But for the leadership, it's about really, really good communication, being able to articulate the vision for transformation, create clarity around purpose so that all that transformation is intentional and that education and industry work together to solve the talent crisis that we're starting to see in many countries around the world. For me, that talent crisis is very, very real. I run Microsoft's education division in the Middle East and Africa. And certainly some of the countries where I work, we struggle to get really good talent with qualities and qualifications that we can see they could adapt across many different contexts. So that agility and resilience is important. And there's a talent war out there as well. So, you know, it works to the advantage of people coming through education to ensure that a lot of work to build their skills and to find out what employers are looking for. And also for employers to work with education to help them understand what's needed to solve that talent crisis.
All right. I like what you did say about a growth mindset, but I'm going to add my own definition then to a transformative leader right now. And I think that, John, a transformative leader should also be one that can solve for that talent crisis. It's huge. You got around 10 million graduates coming into the system, about a fraction of those absorbed by the workplace. And for you, sir, where does that begin? Solving for the talent crisis? Is it the curriculum or is it something more?
Well, I remember the story about asking an actor, you know, tell me about your career. And she said, well, I haven't had a career. I've had a series of roles. And I think what happens actually in life, and that's why the credentialization that Jay's talking about is so important. You change roles and you need to upskill. So do those credentials is important. But I'd also like to say that transformational leadership is interesting. I mean, you took issue with, in a kindest possible way with Malcolm's sort of pale male, slightly grizzled, look, same as me. Now,
not necessarily the paleness, but more the silver fox.
But it's true. But it's true, isn't it? Now, what do elders do in society? What should they do? What do the elders in education do? They shouldn't be the people who stand up there in a severe and like a sort of a group of people condemning and what. They should be the people. Elders' job is to set boundaries and containment for people while they get excited and learn. So great educators inspire learning. They don't inspire syllabi. Syllabi are desperately important, but syllabi become absolute manacles and chains because they don't move fast enough. So great education. Behind me is yesterday's graduation at Henley in Johannesburg. These are young people working in a company, younger, in their 30s, a lot of them. And look at them, they're having an absolutely fantastic time. What great educators do, they get a syllabus, they encourage people to learn, they paint a vision of how this is useful, and they inspire a generation of learning in people that they're going to carry on, because the syllabi and the content die rapidly. But the engagement with learning and belief in yourself and the understanding of what goes on in your head and how you want to expand your thinking never goes away. And that's what you want to leave graduates with. So the elders need to get behind that and fire them out. Don't fill them up, set them on fire. And that's what great education does. And that's what we can do. That's what transformational leadership does. It leads by illumination and by inflammation.
Yeah. No, the graduates behind you looking really happy there. I can see that you guys had a great time at that ceremony. Dr. Rose, ma'am, just give us an indication of how it is going on your side of the world. Just this relationship and I suppose a rapport between the education sector and the private sector. How are those conversations going? How is that alignment between the two parties in producing the skills that each actually want and each can actually use in this current environment? Dr. Rose, you are on mute, ma'am.
I was muted. So I'm saying today we cannot deal with education without bringing private sector on board. Education has to provide responses to what the community, to what the private sector needs. So this is why this dialogue between private sector and leadership of the country, but also the leadership of education, being high learning institution, because this is where we are, this continuous dialogue, but also this internship program. Because if we don't bring them, we'll never know what the market needs today. So here in Rwanda, there is a continuous dialogue between private sector, between industries. Of course, we don't have many as we wish, but the education has to provide us also a response to the concerns of the community. So which means this continuous dialogue, industrial attachment, assessment of what is needed on the market is very important.
All right, got you, ma'am. So, Professor McLeaver, just perhaps if you can just circle back to a comment that you made a little earlier that I think it wasn't entirely clear around regulation. And so what kind of regulation you think needs to be in place to enable higher institutions to truly transform for the betterment of the continent?
Yes, thank you, Madam. This new coming, specifically on this e-learning, it is very important that leadership in education puts in place some tools, some regulation. Otherwise, people can tell you, I don't know what is happening elsewhere, but many people will tell you, we have been trained online, I've done this here and there. So it is very important to have, first of all, a dialogue with those responsible for higher education, for higher learning, putting in place rules and regulation, and make sure that we follow up on what is going on. So currently here in Rwanda, the academic leadership is at the front line to ensure that there is an effective blended learning meet the labor market, as you were asking. But first of all, this need assessment where people have been working together in order to put in place the mechanisms. But I think also the regulation is there to help people to achieve the set objectives we have put together in place together. And so it is, laws are there in place to help people to comply, but they have also to be part of their development. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, ma'am. Of course, that question was for Professor McLeave, but Dr. Rose, thanks so much for also adding your color and your comment. No, the more comments, the merrier. Prof. McLeave, just your take on the kind of regulation that's needed to successfully implement transformative leadership in higher education.
Before I address that, could I just say for the record, by the way, that I am actually 28 years old.
You don't look a day past 25, sir. You don't look a day past 25.
It is a hard life in academia. And in terms of regulation, I think one of the issues we face is that there is maybe an overvaluing of traditional qualifications, and we see this in terms of government regulations. Many countries have regulations that restrict the appointment of senior university management to people with PhDs or to people with senior academic profiles. Further down the food chain, what we also see is many regulatory authorities that insist that the people who are teaching and delivering programs must have academic qualifications higher than the level of the program they are teaching at. So, for example, if you are teaching a group of undergraduate students, the lecturer must have at the very least a master's program or master's qualification. What this effectively means is that we are denying ourselves access to an entire workforce that could bring a whole new perspective into education. Many institutions could be managed much better by somebody with an industry background than by somebody with a PhD in microbiology. Many of our students would benefit by being taught from people who are working in the sector that our students want to work in. And at the same time, what we also find within society, and government sector perpetuates this, is that the entry criteria into positions are based upon, very often, undergraduate or postgraduate programs, with not as much value or emphasis placed on skills-based programs. So when I talk about regulatory change, I think we need to move away from this notion that only an academic can teach. We need to move away from this notion that only somebody with a theoretical degree can actually deliver in the workplace. So that was what I meant by changing the regulations.
And then, Jay, as industry, do you think there would be appetite for industry to make their way back to school? And what kind of incentives do you think would need to be thrown in to perhaps ensure that more of that happens?
That's a very interesting question, and I often speak to friends, my partner, about I would love to go back to being a teacher if I could, but the reality is that certainly when it comes to things like compensation and those issues, there is a big difference. But hypothetically, I think there's a lot of room for perhaps a concept around visiting professors or visiting lecturers, where industry experts or people working in industry can go back into universities and be part of a faculty in a part-time or on a guest basis. I've done that myself with universities in this country and also elsewhere in the world. And I think that can provide the best of both worlds in many cases. It can give you that mix of industry expertise and knowledge together with the academic experience and criteria that you would need for a course that was co-validated and recognized. That probably, to me, I think is more realistic than, saying, will people from industry go back into education full time? Because that presents a lot of challenges. But there are ways around every challenge, and I think, again, it comes back to us thinking around the growth mindset and what is possible. So how could we do this? What would it take to do it? Could government support better in this? Should industry be taking a much bigger interest in programs that ultimately will benefit them when well qualified and well prepared graduates leave education and come into industry? You do see a lot of that happening in some parts of the world. I know I have colleagues in the US at Microsoft who do spend a lot of time working with particular institutions and delivering that industry expertise in the manner that I've just outlined. And maybe that's something that we should or government or university leadership should think about. Would that add value to what they do? It's a good question, and I think it's something we all need to get our collective heads around, perhaps.
Yeah, I think, and I agree with you. I mean, I remember being part of a program myself where they were visiting lecturers from industry, and I mean, you always get a better sense of what is going on in that industry, learning from someone who has got skin in the game. And John, I think that is exactly what happens at Henley with some of your programs, and feel free to comment on that. But I suppose that we can't talk about transformative leadership without really emphasizing the importance of technology in that role, right? I don't think it's something that we've touched on quite deeply in this discussion, but I imagine that it goes without say that technology definitely needs to be in that mix, John. John, sir, you are on mute.
I wasn't on mute, my computer was, but anyway, it's a moot point. The 1000th time since lockdown started. But we talk about transformation as if somehow we all know what that means. But let's be a bit more granular. I mean, firstly, there's some transformation needed in South Africa and other places in terms of racial composition. Let's be straight. When I started Henley 10, 11 years ago, we were 30% black and 20% women. We are now 85% black, and we've more than tripled our student intake, and we're 55% women. And that's a big transformation. And then the other transformations are about people who can transform. We have a system that is a bit of a factorified system because it's safe to do that in a moving environment that's rapidly evolving. If any of our economies are going to succeed, we need to bring people who are excluded into it. So the other transformation is people who are not confident in themselves, who don't believe they're smart because they didn't do a degree, but are actually really smart. How do you pull those people in, teach them how to think, get them, oh, I'm actually smart, and then get them into learning while they're working? There's a massive, only 8% of South Africans, I think, get a degree within six years of being able to, leaving school. So a lot of our people are getting them in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and they're loving it. So that transforms people's sense of themselves and of the future. The other transformation we need to think of is about economic transformation. A lot of the countries we're working in are based on basic factors of production. Cocoa and gold in Ghana, Dubai is oil, South Africa is gold and special metals, and Rwanda is very interesting because they're building a whole technology based on information economy, which is very fascinating. How do you transform economies? What are you bringing into? So if you want to transform things, you need to teach people to be good managers. And we talk widely about, and Malcolm touched on this with his, should PhDs lead business schools? Well, I love PhDs and I love great academics, they're wonderful, but not all of them are necessarily very good teachers or managers. And not all managers are good teachers, so we have to manage that. So we actually have to transform the education system itself, because it is, God bless the people running it, they're driven mainly by fear of not getting things right and of lowering their quality and being seen as being cowboys and cow people. They're not. They need to be brave, launch into a sense of we need to build a new form of economy, bring knowledge and creative industries into what we do, allow Africa to emerge, build confidence in people so they are the ones, like behind me, who can go out and start businesses and be successful. So the transformation agenda is wide and big, and we can't do it alone. We all have to work together and be humble about it, because this is bigger than any of us. We've got to do something that's going to build our continents and our economies. We have to do it together.
And we have to do it quickly. I mean, if you just look at the social fabric right now, really fragile, really sensitive. One has to wonder how long people can go on without jobs, without decent pay, without opportunity, and go on, you know, with smiles on their face. The social fabric of the continent in itself is at risk. Dr. Rose, the final word for you, ma'am, and just maybe even closing off with what John did say in what needed to be done and the importance of partnerships in driving this transformation. Perhaps a brief comment on the room for partnerships as you see it, and the room perhaps for some commentary from our international partners.
Okay. Yes. Partnerships are needed at the local level, but also at the international level. This way of doing business, internet, and so on and so forth, has made a little bit life easier. We have some, for example, there is an institution here, Carnegie Mellon, which is teaching from Rwanda, but students are following courses in the US. So, which I think partnerships are needed, whereby you can sit here, like we are doing actually. We are here, but we are following what is happening all over the world. But when we talk about partnerships, our policymakers, the leadership has to come in. This is where, for example, the Ministry of Education organizes meetings with development partners. We are talking about partnership with private sector. Development partners are contributing to e-learning, to reduce also by trying to build schools. We have what we call smart classrooms in the rural areas, but international partnership is very important if we want to transform this continent, this world. Some people, even today, you don't need to go to the United States for attending a meeting in the UN. If you have enough bandwidth, if you have equipment, you can follow from where you are. So in education, I think also this is where we have to start with, partner with those Microsoft and others in order to deliver and to improve what we are doing.
You're right.
Thank you.
All right, and I think that the presence of Microsoft on this panel just speaks to the fact that there is a strong appetite for fostering greater partnerships from international partners, as it were. But to my guests, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. Dr. Rose Mukankomeje, the Director General of Higher Education Council of Rwanda. My 28-year-old, Prof. Malcolm McLeaver, the CEO and the Provost at Lancaster University of Ghana, as well as the Vice Chairman of the Council of Independent Universities. Jay Richards Hill, the Director of Education Industry for Middle East and Africa at Microsoft, as well as Jonathan Foster-Pedley, the Dean and Director of Henley Business School.